Salam, everyone. Hello, and welcome to Macfest 2021. I'm delighted to welcome you to another fabulous event. Today, we are coming from Oldham in Greater Manchester. I am Barbara Dresner. I'm one of the Macfest team, and I want to thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are in the world. We have got a very special event for you today from Oldham. It is one of Greater Manchester's boroughs, and it's an area rich in the offerings from the Muslim community. First of all, I would like to introduce you to Qaisra Shahraz, MBE, our Director of Macfest. Over to you, Qaisra.
Assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're sitting in the world, everyone. Welcome to our very first Oldham Macfest, as Barbara has just mentioned. It is hosted in partnership with Oldham Libraries and their partners. Macfest is an international award-winning festival, and its mission is to promote peace and harmony, promote community cohesion, and break barriers. We aim to connect communities through art and cultural activities, to spread sweetness, happiness, and celebrate diversity. Our slogans are celebrating arts and connecting communities, and spread honey, not hate, which says it all. Any town or city in partnership with us can host their very own local Macfest, as long as it's with the same mission to celebrate diversity, bring communities together through multi-art forms and cultural activities. I'm delighted to share that Oldham is one of the first places who are keen to host Macfest. Thank you so much to Samuel Thornley and his team and his colleagues, and from the council and from the gallery and from the Arts Heritage Centre for organising this and taking a lead on it. Truly grateful to you, Sam, a personal friend for many years who has hosted me as a writer. So everyone, welcome to our guests, participants joining us this day to put Oldham on our Macfest map. I'm also very grateful and absolutely thrilled that we have got the High Sheriff of Greater Manchester, Diane Dawkins, also joining us. I'm really delighted. And of course, many other special guests joining us too. So everybody enjoy. We have indeed a feast in store for you, and Sam will share the details for this day. So back to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you, Qaisra. So I'm so thrilled to welcome and introduce Sam Thornley, who is a Library Development Officer for Oldham Council Libraries. He has worked there for 5 years and has gone from supporting events to planning them. He looks after author visits and literary festivals, as well as the volunteering community. He has been planning Macfest on and off during lockdown and is looking forward to planning many more in the future. And before I hand over to Sam, I'm going to remind you of our wonderful Macfest brochure, where you can find all of the events, many of which have been recorded, and I would encourage you to follow and to message out on social media to all your contacts. So enjoy, and over to you now, Sam.
Salam and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Apologies if I don't look at my screen. I'm just going to read my notes if it looks like I'm not paying attention. Welcome to Oldham's very first Macfest. Hopefully the first of many. It's taken a long time planning all these events in the past year due to everything that's happened with COVID and lockdowns, but hopefully, knock on wood, we're now seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's now time to share joy again. We couldn't think of a better way to do that than by highlighting and celebrating our Oldham's diverse community with this festival. We've got a whole host of activities on today, starting with this author event and talk. And we'll be sharing all sorts of crafts, singing and fun throughout the day on our Facebook page and the Macfest UK Facebook page, which will be linked in the chat. And it'll be linked in your booking information that you've got today. So have a look there. We'll end today with an author event with Musaid Khan, who's also joining us this morning, and he'll be on at 3 p.m. back on this link. So feel free to just click back on and join us again. We hope you enjoy the day, and we thank you again for joining us. I now have the great honour of introducing the High Sheriff of Greater Manchester, something I didn't think I would be doing at all when I was planning this event, but I'm very happy to do. It's amazing to host and have people such as the High Sheriff join us for this event, truly showcasing the importance of diversity and sharing with others. I know that she's done excellent work as a solicitor and is a great supporter of charity and the volunteer sector, all whilst managing to be a scout leader and all-round incredibly busy person, I imagine. Volunteering is a very noble pursuit and something very dear to us, as the majority of the contributions to today's festival are voluntary and in the pursuit of raising awareness. The library service itself welcomes the opportunity for those in need to volunteer. We make it our aim to be inclusive. I'll highlight her work with the Women's Refuge, in which she is a trustee, a group close to us as well through our Reading Friends project. We've actively tried to promote women during this festival, as they are another group that are often underrepresented. Please join me in welcoming High Sheriff Diane Hawkins.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam, and salam and hello to everybody out there. I'm really privileged to be asked to launch Oldham Macfest today. And what an amazing week it's been for Macfest, when it's just been announced that Macfest has newly awarded the honour of the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service. That really is so richly deserved and reflects everything that you and all your volunteers do. So Macfest is unique. Today is unique, as we know, the first digital Oldham Macfest. And the reasoning behind Macfest is absolutely excellent. And it truly does what it says on the tin. It spreads honey, not hate. And it brings people together in such a joyful and positive way, educating and building understanding without preaching. And that is so important, particularly in the light of current world events. And it's such an inspiration to all of us and shows what can be done. Many thanks to Qaisra for having that brilliant inspiration in the first place, in the wake of the arena bombing, and what a success it has been, growing exponentially since then. So I really would echo the welcome to everybody today, wherever you are, not just in Oldham, but throughout the world. It's fantastic to be joined by so many people. And I think it's appropriate just to comment on what your own volunteers have said, because they say it all. Macfest is important because it gives Muslims a voice, a way to prove ourselves as useful members of the community, and we showcase our true behaviour and way of life. Volunteering isn't something to be taken lightly. It needs to be treated with the utmost respect because it's fun. It's a reason to meet new people and embrace cultural traditions. And finally, Macfest gives me hope and joy to be a part of the big British community. So I'm honoured and delighted to join you today, and I really look forward to learning a lot more alongside you all. I declare Oldham Macfest 2021 truly launched.
Thank you very much. I now have the honour of introducing Councillor Shahid Mushtaq to give us a Oldham perspective on the festival. He's a great supporter of the library and gallery service. You might have seen him lead a story time online on our Facebook page, and I know he's been a great supporter of Macfest as well as diversity, community and arts in Oldham in general. He represents our Alexandra Award, which is a brilliant example of Oldham's diversity and different cultures working together to create the wider Oldham community. I'll now hand over to the councillor so he can share a few words.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all for the introductions so far. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Muslim Art and Culture Festival, or Macfest, which is debuting in Oldham on this historic occasion. I've worked with founder Qaisra Shahraz previously, she is someone with an extreme passion for Islam, art, culture, reading, writing, and everything associated with the side of faith and culture that isn't portrayed in the media as being an integral part of Islam and the contributions the faith has made to the Western world. At a time of upheaval and turmoil across the world, the work of Macfest is vital in highlighting the wealth of talent, innovation, and inspiration existing and flourishing in the Muslim world. Macfest brings to the fore the culture that exists and can be shared with, taught to, and learned by the people of all faiths and none. This is a face of the Islamic world that can bring together and unite at a time when division appears to dominate. If you love art and culture, you love life. Inherently, you will see past differences rooted in faith, race, gender, geography, and all other obstructions because your gaze is locked onto a thing of beauty, something that is beautified because it's different, not because it's the same as what you've come to expect and have grown up with. The beauty of art and culture is that they're so very different depending on where they were born, in what religion, from which people, and in what time. Art and culture is an arena in which difference is the beauty that binds us, not an arena where difference is the poison that divides us. On that note, I'd like to formally welcome you to Macfest Oldham 2021. I'd like to thank all those involved in making this happen and hope you all enjoy the festival, hopefully the first of many to come in Oldham. Thank you.
Thank you again, hi Sheriff and Councillor Mushtaq for those brilliant openings to the festival. And thank you to everyone for joining us. We're also joined by a Principal Officer of Gallery Oldham Arts and Heritage, Sean Bagley, who will be giving a few words at the end of the main event. We're now looking forward to moving on to the main event, a very interesting conversation between Christina Longington and Dr. Shamin Mia of the University of Huddersfield. They'll be discussing Christina's writing and research as well as his own, that they've worked very closely together on this project. I won't take up any more of their times. I'm sure they'd like to introduce themselves and get talking with you all. Please join me in welcoming Christina Longington and Dr. Shamin Mia.
Hello.
Hello.
Good morning, everyone. I'm trying to navigate myself. Okay, so I'm assuming that everybody can hear me. I'm Shamin Mia. I am born and live in Oldham. My sins, I teach across the Pennines in the School of Education. My main areas of interest is sociology of education and Muslim communities within the diaspora. So that's a little bit about myself. Now, I've known Christina Longden and the Longden families for over 20 years, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the honor to actually facilitate this conversation on a remarkable history and also remarkable family history as well. So I'm not going to actually give the bulk of the information away, but what I'm going to hopefully do is just to identify the structure of today. Christina will introduce herself shortly, followed by 10 minutes, a whistle tour, a presentation of her research and her book, and then that would be followed up by a conversation between me and Christina on some of the key contents of the actual presentation, and that should hopefully take us about 10 minutes or so, or 10-15 minutes, and that will give the remaining 15-20 minutes or so for question and answers. Can I just remind people, if you're asking a question, if you can actually write your question on the Q&A box down below, or if you're able to, you can actually just quickly write the question within the chat. Unfortunately, for technical reasons, we won't be able to unmute individuals for people to actually ask direct questions. So if you've got any question or any comments, if you can actually just put them down within the actual chat boxes, and then we can actually take them right at the end. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Christina. She'll introduce herself and then give us a quick 10 minutes, a visual representation of Robert Rashid Stanley and her wonderful research project.
Thank you very much, Shamim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I hope you can all hear me and see me. It's really strange, isn't it, doing things online? It's much easier when you're in an audience with people. But yeah, I'm really pleased to be doing this session with Shamim, because we go back, as he says, a long way, friendships through the family. But we also went on a tour we went to Palestine and Israel a few years ago, and this was when we first got chatting about this remarkable family history, which I'm now going to give you a whistle-stop tour of. And Shamim was one of the people that said, this is a book, you know, this is an amazing story. This touches so many different strands of the sort of things that we all need to learn more about. And if you, who is a writer, Christina, isn't going to write the book, then who is? So in the end, I decided, yes, I would write the book. I very much felt it was my brother's story at the time, which I will go into reasons for a little bit later. But in the end, I think people were quite right saying, actually, no, this is everybody's story. And this man's life represents everybody's story for many, many reasons. So just to say, yes, I'm a writer. I am writer in residence for Kirklees, just over the hill from Oldham. And I grew up in Stalybridge, Duckenfield area, but I did live and work in Oldham for a number of years, specifically around the Gwaddick area. So I'm very familiar with Oldham. It's very much home, and I'm so delighted that the libraries are doing this in partnership with Macfest, because for me, the libraries is what it's all about, you know, complete equality, access to information and education for everybody. So hopefully there's many, many more events that we'll be able to do with Macfest over the next few years, because it's making such a difference to people, the way that we're sharing this information. So I will do a quick tour of Robert's life. Now, bear in mind, Robert Rashid Stanley was my great, that's three greats, grandfather, and he was born in 1828 and he died in 1911. So this is 83 years. This is, you know, for the Victorian era. He was born before Victoria was born. He was born 10 years before Victoria came to the throne. And so he went through several monarchs. He lived a long time, and I can't cram all that into 10 minutes. So I think what Shamim's role is here is going to cherry pick the bits that he's interested in specifically, and maybe the bits that you're interested in, you can bob some questions in the panel to us. So what I'll do now is I'll just start screen sharing for 10 minutes. And forgive me if there's information in this that you think, whoa, hang on, slow down. It's just that there's so much to pack in. So let's start off. Here we are. Hopefully you can see this. Please shout or raise your hands if you can't see it. But this is Robert Stanley, who was one of the earliest mayors of Stalybridge. This is one of the three photographs that we have of him, and this is him as mayor of Stalybridge. And the first thing I would like to say is this is not just a story about, I suppose, British Islam, but it's also a very British working class story, and it's a political story, and it's a story of its time. One of the main reasons being is Robert was born into a very working class family. He had no money, but he did have a rich uncle, which I'll go into a little bit further. He was a fascinating character himself. But because of this, when you're from the working classes, particularly at this point in history, you don't keep written records. There's no value in written records, and if you do, they're much more likely to be destroyed. So if you're lucky enough at this point in history to be literate anyway, to read and write, it's about having access to the information to write your history or your ponderings down. It's not like Facebook where you just stick your dinner on and everybody can see it. And also being able to afford pen and paper and that kind of thing. So for this reason, we had no information on this man. He was the mayor of Stalybridge, and he came to live in Ashton-under-Lyne when he was 10 years old. The family are from the area, but they'd gone down to Cardiff to try and make some money. And then unfortunately, they didn't make any money. So they had to send a little 10-year-old Robert back up to Ashton-under-Lyne, where his rich uncle lived. So I shall just move this along. these are the two books that I've written. So the first one, the green one, His Own Man, is very much, I suppose, using academic research, try and make it quite accessible to people. It's basically biographical information, all the research that we've done. And Imagining Robert fills the gaps because, as I said before, if you're from the working classes, there are so many question marks because the history isn't written down usually by the people themselves. So this bit was me using my own imagination, a fictional account, if you like, of his life. That's a picture of my family up there in the Liverpool Mosque, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. So there's two books there that you can purchase, and if books aren't your thing, go and have a quick look at the trailer, which a wonderful friend of ours, Connor Ibrahim, did, a little film starring my dad, that's my dad, with Robert Rashid's Fez. So he's a bit of a film star in his pensioner years. He's quite an actor. So this all began, I would say, with my dad. Again, very quiet man. You won't get him up here talking like his daughter, but he was fascinated with family history. And when he was made redundant, he was actually a lorry mechanic in Sailor Bridge. He was made redundant and he decided to throw himself into his family history. One of the first characters he was interested in was his great-great-granddad, this Robert Stanley, who was a mayor. So that was really impressive. We've got a mayor in the family, the mayor of Sailor Bridge, our hometown. And he asked people in our extended family, did they know anything about him other than the birth and the death, which you can get the death and birth certificates of quite easily. And somebody said, no, they didn't know anything, but we did have a really strange thing, which was a little magazine here, which you can see. It's called The Crescent. Many of you will know this is the first ever magazine recording of British Islam. And it was published by a man called Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, who many of you will know about. And in it was an interview with a man called Robert Stanley, except it said Rashid Stanley. And in the interview, this was a tale of his journey from being a Christian to becoming a Muslim. There was a photograph. Undoubtedly, that was our great-great-great-granddad wearing a fez. So this was a shock anyway. One of the reasons it was a big shock was because my own brother, Stephen, had converted to Islam just a few years before this discovery. So we'd had nearly 100 years of a guy who'd converted to Islam in the family, nobody knowing about it, and we can talk about the reasons why that was. But also a few years before this, my own brother had converted. Now, I should explain, we're not a religious family. We don't sit there studying religions of the world and traveling the world. You know, we've never had the money to do that or the time. But this just kind of, I suppose, been dug down into the earth and then resurfaced. And the next thing that resurfaced was somebody else, an elderly cousin of my dad, had something in a cupboard, which was a fez, and he had been told that this belonged to Robert Stanley, and he kept it, and he had no idea why. He had no idea that Robert Stanley had become a Muslim. He just kept the fez because it's lovely, and we still have the fez, which is amazing. And then the next item that resurfaced was a tiny little pin that my granny had, and she knew it belonged to him, but she had no idea of the significance of the Star and Crescent of Islam on the pin, which we think was part of belonging to the Liverpool Mosque. So Dad decided to do some research and he put together a wonderful pamphlet, all the basic facts and figures. He worked so hard with another relative of ours, my auntie Gay, and they pieced together the parts of their life that had been hidden. And I decided, well, I wanted to find out even more than this. There is so much more detailed information to spend time on doing. So I did that. And that's, I went through all the town council minutes in the archives in Tameside in Ashton and Law, and I spent hours and hours and hours. And it was the first time I finally saw his signature. Bearing in mind, we had nothing of his. That's when I came across his signature as mayor, and all the minutes and all the things that he'd said. The newspapers were fantastic. So even though they still haven't been digitised, please get on to digitising the North West newspapers, British Archives. I had to go through the old-fashioned microfiche system, completely ruined my eyesight, sitting there peering at these screens for days and days and days. But I tell you now, it was worth it because the information that we got was just incredible. So just a bit of a background here for those of you who aren't aware about I suppose the history of the Industrial Revolution in the north of England, which was where it all happened. So there's a wonderful photograph up there of Stalybridge. And I would like to say as well, it's fantastic that we're actually doing this in Oldham today, because Stalybridge and Ashton and Oldham were massive rivals during this part of history, very much because it was, which was I suppose the wealthiest town in terms of production of cotton. which obviously capitalism based itself on during the Industrial Revolution. And there's a great tale that I found out when I was doing my research in the newspapers. When these towns are criticising each other, there was a case in Manchester in the 1870s, a man who'd committed a crime, and the magistrate said to him, "I believe that you're from Oldham." And he said, "That can say anything, but don't say I'm from Stalybridge. Say I'm from anywhere, but not from Stalybridge." So there was this joke about Stalybridge being, a really rough, tough area. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were very interested in Stalybridge. Engels based a lot of his work in the condition of the working classes on visiting Stalybridge and the horrific conditions there. So this is where Robert was as a young man. He lived in Ashton, as I said before, when he came at the age of 10, and his family, his rich Uncle John, who had made his money through the cotton industry, was a Christian Israelite. Now I could talk for another 10 hours about the Christian Israelites, because I ended up going down a rabbit hole, as you do, with this research and finding out about this incredible group of people. Robert was married in the Christian Israelite sanctuary. So when my dad got his marriage certificate, that's when we found out he was part of the Christian Israelites group. Now they very much follow the Mosaic tradition. So the three faiths really keeps coming full circle all the time, the Abrahamic traditions. And John Rowe established what was known then as a Christian Israelite church, and they ate kosher food, the men were circumcised, they followed the 10 Commandments, they followed the same dress codes as in the Old Testament. But as Robert got older and he moved to Stalybridge and he set up his own little grocer's shop, he started going to the Church of England. And again, there's a great piece of research done by a former vicar of Stalybridge who talks about the Battle of the Two St George's, where basically the Church of England fell out big time in Stalybridge, and it was all over the national press. It was even mentioned in Parliament. And Robert went to that top octagonal church there when he was in his early 20s with his wife and his children. But this is a backdrop to his life, really. So he witnessed what was happening. He was part, I suppose, of the wise men of the town. Even though he was a very working class man, he was very soon seen to be somebody to go to for information, not just about politics and about trade, because he was a tradesman, he ran a shop, but about the world, because he was very interested in international issues. And for those of you that are interested in issues such as immigration, one of the things that really wowed me, this is my area, so Stalybridge, Ashton, Duckenfield, Oldham, this is the area that I grew up, and I had no idea, because we didn't get taught about this in school, the level of immigration of the Irish during this period. So during the 1860s, the population in Stalybridge and Ashton, for example, almost within the space of 2 years grew from something like 5% Irish to 50% Irish as a result of the Great Famine in Ireland. So of course, in the newspapers at the time that I'm reading, it's the same old, stuff that we hear today. They're coming over here, they're taking our jobs, and there was massive hatred against the Roman Catholic Irish. And there was a man called Murphy. If you want to go up and read about the Murphy riots, it's fascinating. He came to England trying to whip up hatred against Roman Catholics, and there were riots in particular in the big cities in England, but especially in Stalybridge and Ashton, where they were very violent. And this is when Robert was really, I suppose, a young man in his 30s still, witnessing all of this on his doorstep. Now, Manchester was incredibly radical. Those of you that know anything about Peterloo, that have seen the film, will perhaps be quite shocked to discover that in 1861, we had riots in Stalybridge. And again, we're talking about 1819 in Peterloo, where the troops stormed the people with their swords and attacked them. It happened in Stalybridge, which hardly anybody knows about, but I discovered this. This is part of the Lancashire cotton famine. So the backdrop is already, we have radical politics, we have Chartism, we have people calling for the vote for the working man, the working man at this time, women came a bit later. We had the anti-poor law movement, which was just basically the establishment was shoving the poorest people into workhouses, which was just an awful way to live your life. Kids were working 12, 13, 14 hours a day, so there was a call to reduce the number of hours that the kids were working in factories and up chimneys and down mines. Robert himself was working at the age of 10. So we had all of these issues, and Robert was actually asked to Parliament in 1869 to give his evidence to Parliament, just some grocer in Stalybridge, to give his evidence to half of the British cabinet on why he felt men should or shouldn't have the right to a private ballot, because at this point, if you were one of the tiny minorities of working men to have the vote, you had to go and cast your X in front of the entire town on a blackboard in the middle of the marketplace. So the potential for corruption and bribery and beating if you voted the wrong way, because you basically, the masters in charge of the cotton factories dictated the way you should vote. If you went against that, it was trouble. Now, by this point, Robert was a magistrate, so he'd gone down to Parliament, he'd been asked for his opinion, but he'd also witnessed the bread riots, which I think, and it's difficult to prove this, but if you look at these two photographs, the one on the left is from a newspaper that Robert had kept. We have no idea why he kept it, but he had that shop on the left, and we only know that because we knew he was a tea merchant. And then when we retrace the steps, there's a photograph of my dad and my brother here, when we retrace the steps to the number on the census for 1861, that was Robert's shop. So we know that the artist who was sent down from the Manchester Guardian and the group of newspapers in Manchester to draw what had happened in Stalybridge at that time represented what was going on. The people were starving to death because Lincoln had stopped the cotton coming over from the USA because he needed to break the economic might of the South. And in order to do that, you stop the cotton, because the cotton is what the economy was built on. But of course, the knock-on effect was that the working class operatives in Manchester, half of the factories shut. In Stalybridge and Ashton, it was more like 65% of the factories were shut. So people were literally starving and out of work. So they rioted for bread. Robert's shop was one of the ones targeted, so the shop owners were throwing bread from the top windows down to the people so that the looting would stop. But you can see the shop there actually being broken into, and that was just an amazing discovery to have found out. But his outside interest, which we can talk about a little bit more in a minute, very much, I think, came from his association with David Urquhart, who was a Turkophile. He was a British diplomat sent really to keep an eye on the Turks in Constantinople. But when he came back, he never converted to Islam, but he was absolutely fascinated with the Turkish way of life, with the values of the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. And he very quickly sided, feeling that they were being persecuted by the British Empire. Robert was a Tory, but he was very much a municipal socialist, which at the time was all about public reform. So he, for example, headed up the building of the market hall in Stalybridge. Now, this was before he was a mayor. He was just some grocer on a street corner, but people respected him that much that they wanted him to head up the committee to build that beautiful market building that is still there. He was also in the committee to build Dovstones Reservoir, which I'm sure many of you know about. Stamford Park as well. He was one of the original trustees. And so he was heart really of Stalybridge for several years whilst he was the mayor, and he was extremely liked, so much so that the worst thing that the press could even try and dredge up to say about him was he was too young, and he wasn't fat enough, and he wasn't bald enough to be the mayor. And I think if that's the worst thing that somebody can say about you, you're doing pretty well in the media. And so he was a very popular mayor until 1876, when the Ottomans were involved in a massacre of the Bulgarian Christians. And what happened after that, Robert really felt was being preyed upon by Gladstone. Robert wasn't a fan of Gladstone at all, and he felt that Gladstone was whipping up a storm, and all the mayors across Britain were told to call a meetings to condemn what the Turks had done. And Robert issued a statement to say, of course we condemn it, but I believe that Abdul Hamid II, who was the caliph at the time, has put measures in place to stop this from happening ever again. So I'm not going to call a meeting because I actually feel you're whipping up hysteria in the country. And because of this, the rich men of the town, and they were all rich, none of these were grocers, they were all the millionaires, turned on Robert and basically said, look, I think they were just shocked and appalled that he'd had his own stance and he'd thought about this carefully and he wasn't going to do it. And they just vilified him. And even in Parliament, he was mentioned as who does this mayor think he is, refusing to call a meeting to condemn the atrocities. And he retired from politics in 1876. And strangely, he went to become a landlord at the New Inn pub in Ashton. He still had his tea business. He still had his little grocer's business in Stalybridge, just not even a mile away. But for 18 years, he ran that pub with his family, his wife, and he had 11 kids. Very important fact that I should mention right at the beginning. 11 kids and a tiny little grocery shop in Stalybridge. So proper working class bloke this is. But from the pub, he started writing to the caliph. And we only know this because of Quilliam's magazine, The Crescent. And so he obviously established a rapport. He asked him the head of the Islamic, the head of the Islamic world for a new English translation of the Quran, because it couldn't be trusted to read a translation of the Quran if it had been written by a Christian, which he had. He wanted one translated by a Muslim. So he lobbied the government. He was writing to the Times all the time. He really felt that the government's foreign policy was very wrong. And then he moved to Manchester in 1897. And it was at this point he obviously met Abdullah Quilliam, the most famous white Victorian convert that we know. And in his presence, he said Shahada in April 1898. Quilliam very soon after appointed him, Rashid Stanley, as the vice chairman of the Liverpool Mosque. And this photograph here is really the only other photograph that we've got, which we just stumbled across by mistake when a friend said, "I'm sure that's your great-great-great-granddad." And that is like looking at my dad wearing a fez behind Quilliam. When he died, when his wife died rather, another strange thing happened was I decided to find the original birth certificate rather than the typed one with the handwriting, because I had an inkling that he knew Emmeline Pankhurst, because in Manchester they lived just around the corner. And sure enough, Emmeline Pankhurst there signed my great-great-great-granny's death certificate. So this was a man who was incredibly well connected. If you just read the present, his name's mentioned an awful lot. He meant a lot to Quilliam quite clearly. But at the end of his life, a lot of people think it's quite sad. He moved back to Stalybridge. His wife had died, and his children were all grown up. And he moved in with his daughter to a house on Wakefield Road in Stalybridge, which is still there. Just a tiny little 2-bed terrace. And he died in 1911. And he was buried in a Christian grave. Possibly, I think, because being a typical bloke from Stalybridge, he would have said, well, paid for it, I'm going to go in it, and that's where my wife is and my kids are. Quilliam had to leave the country, which those of you that know the history will know the reasons why. And after 1911, that was it. No more talk of this Robert who had become Rashid Stanley, who was the mayor of Stalybridge. End of. We didn't talk about this for 100 years. Nobody knew about it. There are many reasons for that. The obvious one being that only a couple of years later, the First World War broke out, and obviously Turkey, who he was great friends with and a great admirer of, sided with the Germans. So you weren't really going to be talking about that. So that's the end of my whistle-stop tour. If you want to, I'll stop screen sharing now. And Shamim, if you want to ask any questions or add your own two penneth, because I know you're a bit of a scholar of Rashid Stanley yourself.
No, thank you very much, Christina. That was absolutely fascinating. I know I've read the book couple of times, but it's always refreshing to hear the story again. I mean, it's really fascinating. So thank you very much for that. I just want to pick up 3 things, and then perhaps I can ask you a few questions if that's okay. I mean, the 3 things that I think that comes to my mind as far as as I'm listening to your wonderful presentation. The first is as far as Robert Rashid Stanley and the working class history. And I think that's really, really important, because often the case when history is actually written, it's written top down. History is from the point of view of the kings and the queens and the people that actually work in the factories, on the down the mines, etc. Their history isn't necessarily documented because it's not necessarily seen as important. Connected with that, I mean, if you look at the key landmarks, the names or the statues that's actually being built, they're always the case of mostly men, always men, and it's always the factory owners, etc. But we very, very rarely do we actually get a glimpse of working class history. So that's I mean, the book is fascinating for that history alone. So I know I've said this before, but I really want to kind of congratulate you, on that, because it's a documentation of working class history. Second, I think it's a fascinating history of Muslim presence in Britain. I know there's been a number of books looking at the role of Islam in Britain, dating back to the 15th century, 14th century, etc. There's been a significant interest amongst academics charting the relationship between Islam and Britain. What this book basically does is to highlight the relationship between Muslims in Britain, because it's often assumed that the history of Muslim presence starts after 1945. And what this documentation basically does is to highlight the history of Muslims in Britain prior to the mass migrations of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent. So that's really crucial, because often the case when people actually talk about Muslims, they associate with Asian presence. They don't necessarily associate with individual Muslim converts, and blonde hair, blue eyes isn't a kind of visual representation of Muslims. So that's really it's really crucial in that respect. So it offers a counter reading or alternative reading of Muslim history in Britain, and the fact that you had to kind of almost kind of excavate the archival materials, actually get to the nub of the history, demonstrate the layering of information that one has to kind of actually go through in order to actually access this history. And I guess my question now is that how many other Robert Rashid Stanleys are there, not only within the Greater Manchester area, but throughout Britain? And I think this is the duty that I think of young scholars and young historians to kind of go and do some kind of really innovative work. So that's just my kind of my response. And as I was listening to the wonderful presentation, that was the things that was actually coming to me. Now, what I'd like to ask Christine, if you don't mind, is that you mentioned the relationship between Robert Rashid Stanley and the Liverpool community, and that's really central as far as the history of Muslims in Britain, because what you have is Robert Rashid Stanley as an individual living in Stalybridge doing some fantastic work. But over in Liverpool, you don't necessarily have individual, but rather you have an established community, a really active community as well. And it has a global significance as far as the Ottoman Empire, etc. I was just wondering if you can just tease out some of the relationship between Robert Rashid Stanley, William Quilliam, and also that kind of really important kind of history of Muslims in Liverpool. If you could just unpick that slightly.
Yeah, and that's the difficult one, is actually knowing how they met. People ask me how they met. I can only make assumptions that because Robert was clearly such an avid reader. I mean, I've read some of the letters are in the book, they're all from the Crescent. The letters that he writes, if you think this is some guy we just written off as some working class grocer in Stalybridge, the level of his knowledge on international affairs is just remarkable. And I have to remind myself, we think now that we know so much more about the world because we've got the internet and non-stop news, and we're connected constantly through the internet. How much more the people, particularly the working class people, depended on international affairs then than they do now, because that was what put the food on your table. If something was happening in the deep south of America, the cotton is, and anything that you want from around the world, the British Empire relied, as we know, extracting everybody else's resources and bringing them here. So people's life and their death relied on them having information about what was going on. And I think Robert was the conduit. So I think he very soon became known as the person that knew everything. In 1861, he I think it was a meeting of 300 people in Stalybridge to discuss whether the American Civil War should end. And it was just some bloke, some grocer called Robert Stanley. I noticed his name as I'm scrolling through this newspaper. His name leapt out. He'd been asked to chair that meeting just as a grocer. So he was amassing this information. And I think at some point he read about Quilliam, because he was reading everything. And of course, he was going to the Manchester Corn Exchange to get his tea and to blend it and to bring it back to Stalybridge, which would have been filled with traders from all around the world, with merchants from China, from Turkey, from Levant, everywhere, selling tea and spices and different things. And he would have got talking to people. This is where I think he first heard about an alternative view British foreign policy and he was hearing it from the horse's mouth, what was going on, rather than what the Times and what the Guardian was writing. So I think that's what made him think about the world. And at some point he clearly met Quilliam, probably in Liverpool, but Quilliam travelled to Manchester a lot. He used to go to Robert's house to have tea before he'd do a talk, and that's when he went to the mosque and he met the people for the first time. But he was already writing to the Crescent before he took Shahada. 3 years before, he was obviously reading the Crescent and amassing this information, and that I think explains why Quilliam already trusted him and appointed him as the vice president of the Liverpool Muslim Institute. And there is no records other than what's in the Crescent, which is obviously their relationship. They went to tea together, they hung out together, they were obviously good family friends, and I think that's why Robert moved to Manchester. I think that Quilliam probably had plans for the same kind of community being fostered and developed in the way that the LMI did it in Liverpool, with Rashid being seen to be, I suppose, the kingpin in that area. The actual area where he lived was on the edge of Victoria Park, where we knew there was a mosque as well. So I think that's the key thing between the community, and I think it was being fostered already in Manchester, but we don't have the records in the same way that we do for the mosque in Liverpool.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can I just remind the audience, please, if you've got any questions, if you can just put them down in the chat or the Q&A box, that would be very much appreciated. Now, my next question, Christine, obviously you mentioned this in the opening segment of your presentation, and that's the history of your brother, Steve, his conversion to Islam. And obviously this was prior to your father unearthing this fascinating information about your great-great-great-grandfather who's converted to Islam. So I'm just wondering if you could just unpick that slightly. I mean, obviously that's really interesting, interesting story. So if you could, I mean, because I mean, obviously I know I've heard it from Steve and yourself.
Yeah.
Where was Steve when he received this information? And I mean, if you just kind of the audience in that room when the final news was actually brought.
Yeah, well, my brother and his wife Rosina were living in London at the time. I think Stephen was working for, I think he was working for Medical Aid for Palestinians at the time. And my dad rang him up and he said, basically, I think you really need to sit down. And it was such a shocker for my brother, because I think my brother converted 30 years ago now, 1990s time. So this was a time when there weren't many young white working class blokes wandering around Manchester, having said the Shahada. And he felt very much, wow, I must be the first one in the entire history of our community, of our town, of our family. And it turns out he wasn't. So, I mean, it was massive. I mean, I remember at the time, for me, it was a real shock, because I love history. I've always been into my working class history, but I don't think the significance of it hit me until a few years later, when I started. I mean, I moved off to Africa. I lived with the Bushmen. That's a completely different story. And it was when I came back, I think I'd had those years away from the UK and seen the significance of what had happened. And I think we just kind of took it on the chin and thought, you can imagine in my family what a shock it was for your son to convert to Islam, when you've kind of raised him in this very kind of northern semi-Christian environment, not really religious, but the church is in the background there. So, it was a shock to us. Anyway, as a family. And I think that's the bit that I often don't maybe focus on enough when I'm doing talks, which is how hard it was for my family, for my brother to convert, and how I think we dealt with it incredibly well, given the time. But then Robert's story almost gave the blueprint of how you can deal with it. So in imagining Robert, I really wanted to put those feelings and those experiences from the more, I suppose, people that had a faith like myself in the family, and also the people like my dad who was an atheist. What did we get from my brother's change of life, from his new family that he married and the children that he had? What did we get from that in terms of the connection with how it must have been for Robert? Was it harder for Robert than it was for my brother? I'm not so sure it was, actually. I actually think, from my own research, there was a lot more acceptance of religious difference, as it were. Don't get me wrong, there was persecution, there was Islamophobia, there certainly was, but it didn't really start rearing its head until the early 20th century, it was a bit more acceptable to be a little bit different until we crept towards the First World War, and you know, so all of these issues that we are experiencing now today as a community of Muslims and non-Muslims living together, they experienced then. But I think we go through flashpoints in history where it becomes very difficult. And, you know, 9/11 from that point on, it changed. You know, I like I say, I had several years away from this country and I came back and I saw a massive difference. And that's why I think maybe in the back of my head, this was the push time to write Robert's story, to help people to learn that actually we do have strength together in numbers, and if we understand each other's ways of life better and each other's faith systems better, we just see, you know, that which we have in common, to echo a truism there, and that's what I think Robert is giving us now, if you like, and strangely through me. And just even if you extracted the faith side of it, it's still such a fascinating story. And I think you in particular helped me to learn. I mean, I always knew there was a strong working class tradition of self-led education when there was no education system for people, but I've discovered that a little bit more, and I suppose the very patronizing views that we have of working class people being thick and not well read and not well educated. And even if you're not a reader, you can still be incredibly well educated in different ways. So I think that's the underlying current of the book for me, which is kind of try and keep hold of these histories, and don't just, the problem we have today is we tend to focus on very fast social media, and I don't think that's recorded. That isn't a recorded history, a photograph of your dinner and if you went to the cinema last night. And in a way we're focusing our time and our energies onto that rather than, you know, much more in-depth recording of what's happening in our lives.
Excellent. So thank you very much. I mean, that's some really interesting points there about working class history and working class education, really. And I think it's very useful, that distinction that you make between schooling and education. It's often assumed that you go to school in order for you to get an education, but I guess what you're demonstrating within your own kind of a historical work is that you can also have an education without actually going to school. And there's that kind of a huge rise of the autodidact, you know, the working autodidact. That's been kind of, it's more recently that's you know, obviously been touched upon by historians. Now, if you can just go back, Christina, about, you mentioned that your father, you know, he takes retirement and then is obviously interested in the family history. Now, there's almost a silencing of the fact that, you know, you had someone within your family who converted to Islam. If you can just unpick that, if you don't mind. I mean, obviously, you mentioned that there is a knowledge of someone within your family who's been a mayor, but not the fact that, you know, you had a convert within the family. If you can just, I mean, how easy was it for him to kind of unearth this?
I think it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that strange fact that somebody somewhere in our extended family had kept a copy of the Crescent. I don't think we would have found out about his conversion otherwise. I certainly don't think that many wonderful scholars that I work with now who are really into the Liverpool Muslim Institute and the publications by Quilliam, but you wouldn't necessarily have had the wherewithal to chase down a certain bloke called Rashid Stanley, who was a vice president from this particular time. And that's why I'm really glad, actually, you mentioned earlier on how many more Rashid Stanleys are out there, because one of the problems we have is we all do this as historians, we tend to focus on the easy stuff, the stuff that people have already written books about, and then we try and, you know, find our own particular line and our own particular opinion, and we need to, you know, rather than actually going right back to the primary sources and looking for the name of somebody who seemed quite interesting or not, because often the people that don't seem interesting are, and doing a bit of excavation work. And I would love to see more people who are out, whether they're part of a formal institution or not, looking at the names of the converts and finding out, and perhaps contacting their families, because it's the working class stories, the hidden stories. There are names that you and I will be very familiar with, who the converts of this particular time period, but they were all either middle class or upper class, and they have this huge tradition of recording their family history for posterity. The Rashid Stanleys of the world didn't and don't. And so I think that's why, you know, that's why my dad in particular just I do think if my brother hadn't converted, we might have just gone, well, gosh, that's really interesting. That was a bit weird. What an oddball. Move on. Whereas the fact that my brother had obviously gone through all this himself made us think, wow. So he himself knew that this was wonderful, and then we picked that up as well. And the fact that it was hidden, I tend to put it down to if you're from these mill towns, the Oldham, Ashton, Stalybridge area, and you're from a family that have lived there for generations, there is a mill town mentality, which is don't put your head above the parapet. So you're not going to go, hi, we're mates with the Ottoman Empire and World War I's about to break out, or you're not going to go, hi, we're all a bit different and we do that. You're just not. You're going to put your head down. You're going to love your family for who they are and put up with their eccentricities and then move on. If you haven't embraced the faith yourself, and we've got absolutely no evidence that his wife or his children did, I think if they had, we would have known about this. But the fact is that he didn't force, and I've had this question asked me a lot, what, did he not make his wife? No, he didn't make his wife. You'd never make a Stanley woman do anything. And so, there wasn't that element of coercion, you join my faith, like there might have been. I think there was, in some convert families of the time, but there certainly wasn't in our town from our area. So it was hidden, and again, the conservatism with a capital C and a small c, you're not going to go out there in public and say we're very different, we do things differently. But the spin that the family have put on it, I think, was before my granny died. Obviously this is her great granddad, she hadn't met him, but she knew all about him, but she knew he was the man, they're very proud of him, and but the only thing that she'd known that stuck in her head was he was a Rechabite. And we all went, what's a Rechabite? And if you Google it, it's somebody that abstained from alcohol, named after the tribe of Israel who abstained from alcohol. And another word that you could use for that is temperance. So temperance was massive, absolutely massive at this point in history. So he was known as somebody that practiced temperance. Now, whether or not that was the nice gloss that they put on is a bit weird, and he doesn't drink beer. I think that might have been it. But the fascinating bit is he ran a pub for 18 years. So he might well have run a pub for 18 years and not drunk himself. He'd been a magistrate. He had witnessed the most horrific alcohol problems, really bad, in the town of Stalybridge. And I read case after case after case of absolutely just people riddled with alcoholism who came back 18, 19, 20 times before him. So whether or not he abstained from alcohol before Islam or not, I'm not sure. But given the fact he'd seen what it had done to families, and he had to deal with these cases of children, children drinking whiskey at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10, stealing to get it. And I think that had a huge influence on him. But yeah, I think because the family were not particularly religious, it was easy to just say, oh, he didn't drink.
Yeah, obviously that's an interesting connection between Quilliam and his community as well, because most of the converts, albeit from a middle class background, actually came through the temperance movement. Okay, so there's some couple of questions and observations, if I can just chuck them at you.
Yeah.
There's a question there from Wakar Bhatti, and this is a question about the English Heritage Plaque, because I know the Quilliam community I only got recognition recently, and when I say recently, about 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Is there any effort there to actually have Robert Rashid Stanley recognised in Stalybridge?
Well, we tried a few years ago when James Pennell was the Minister of Work and Pensions as well. He was the MP for the Stalybridge and Hyde constituency, and it was rejected by Tameside Council because they felt, I don't think they, to be fair, I just don't think they realised the impact of this man's life, and that was an impetus for me to go and do some more work on it. They felt that he hadn't brought enough to the area. Sorry. So now the rules have changed slightly and you can apply, but because of austerity cuts, you have to fund your own plaque if it's approved by the committee. And that is an issue that is really annoying for people that need to be recognised. So it is absolutely possible that we could get a blue plaque for Robert, and I do think we should. And I think, if anything, the evidence of the interest of everybody involved in his life now, we should absolutely do that, because he wasn't just a great mayor of Stalybridge. He brought so much attention to Stalybridge, and he's doing that now. and he just led a very unusual life, and I think he is certainly worthy of one. But every single the problem is every single local authority area has different rules to apply for a blue plaque.
Yeah. Oh,
and it also depends, and you know, and I don't say this lightly, but I do think, you know, at the time we did apply for a blue plaque, there was a lot less understanding of British Muslim community and issues. I think perhaps there's a little bit more understanding now. I hope that there is, but you can never be assured of that, because there are people everywhere who hear the M word and come up with the most ridiculous ideas.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that all reminds me really that you know, power isn't always given. You know, people have to take power. I mean, nobody's going to wake up one day and say, let's have a blue plaque, which recognises the contribution of Robert Rashid Stanley. It's actually done through mobilisation of pressure. So if I don't know if Macfest or various other, I know there's Sheriff of Manchester here. I mean, if there's any way that we can actually put some soft pressure on that, I mean, I think that would be.
Yeah, I think in Manchester as well, you know, the fact that he lived there and that he was kind of obviously building up the Muslim community there. The fact is, you know, he was, we've got no proof, but we've got no proof otherwise, he was one of the first Mancunian converts that was growing the community there. And I do think that's worthy of recognition publicly, whether it's a blue plaque or not. I think it would be a wonderful thing to do for the community.
There's another question here from Mina, Christina. I mean, I know that you've been very active on this, and this is about, you know, I mean, if you could just share some of your experiences of going to schools and colleges and sharing this story and making this kind of widely, you know, public. I mean, if you could just share some of that experience, and if there's anybody here that wants to take you up on the offer, I'm sure that you'll be, you know, more than happy to you know, respond.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about doing the writer in residence stuff, well, the bad thing is obviously been COVID during the last year, but it's meant that I'm able to reach more people. So on the Kirklees Library's YouTube channel, there's a talk which I did for Interfaith Week about Robert's life, quite a long talk. Yeah, I think I've done about 25 different public talks. I mean, bear in mind we've had lockdown as well. That's quite an achievement since the book came out. And it's been lovely to speak to very different communities. Sometimes it's been like 100% Muslim community, and other times it's been 100% not Muslim community. And I particularly like it when it's mixed. I think one of the best talks that I did was it was at Halifax Library, and it was really emotional because it was a good number of people, but for some reason the vibe, people felt really able to share. So we had quite emotional sharings by some of the Muslims living in the Halifax area who were explaining how in recent years the abuse and the experiences they've had has just gone off the scale, and explaining how they came to this country and it was different. And of course there was always, you know, low-level stupidity going on, but it's gone through the roof recently. And the non-Muslims there, you know, they contacted me afterwards to say, I've never heard that from the horse's mouth. Wow, I'm really quite angry about this and fight. And it was great that it was Robert's story that appeals to people who aren't Muslims, because it's local history and it's family history and it's a wow, wonderful story. And people that are Muslims who just go, wow, you know, there is a history of this in the British Isles, and it brought them together. So, you know, that seems to happen in most talks that I do. There's always that dynamic, but whether it's young people who are absolutely shocked, because like you just said at the beginning, people just think this began in the 60s, the history of British Islam, and they realise it goes way, way, way back. So that's why I love doing this. Every single talk I do has got a different feel to it, and I get so much out of it. And, you know, sometimes I said to my brother, oh, it sounds really pathetic, but I just kind of feel I'm not really worthy of doing this. Can't somebody else do it? Because it feels like quite a burden at times to be representing something of a faith that I don't have. I follow the Quaker tradition, and he's just going, oh, shut up, go and do it. But yeah, it's a wonderful responsibility to have, and I just kind of wish more people would know about him. But obviously, as you said, sometimes you've just got to go out there and knock on doors like I have been doing, and it's wonderful that people are now coming to me and saying we found out about him and we live on the other side of the world.
Oh, fascinating. Sadly, we've kind of run out of time, really. So I really want to thank Christina and everybody else that's you know, taken, you know, time out from this wonderful Saturday morning, or afternoon now, really, isn't it? So thank you very much for that. So it's a wonderful presentation. Please, please, please go and buy both of the books. It's not very expensive. I'm sure it's just a couple of Costa coffees. So it's a very huge contribution. But also it really spreads the the knowledge, spreads the kind of the history and the story. But also it gets people reading. So that's basically one of the most important things, that we really need to actually do is get more people actually reading. But the story in itself, as Christina, articulated, it's a way of adding humor, not necessarily humor, adding humanity to a community that's been dehumanized. I mean, obviously, from reading the papers or watching the media, you've got so much kind of bad press against Muslims and also working class people as well. We don't necessarily draw those kind of connections, those intersectional ways of looking at the world. But I mean, that's fascinating history. So please do find some time and read. But also, if you have any events, or if you're I don't know, on school governors, or if you want Christina to actually come in, I'm sure she'll be more than happy. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
I don't know. Do I need to pass the virtual mic over to
Sean? Might be wanting to come on. I'm not sure.
Sean needs to come in to finally wrap up and say thank you. And okay, Sean, back to you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm.
Hi, Sean.
I hope everyone can hear me now. Thank you so much to Christina and to Shamim for that fascinating presentation. I was following it in the chat, and the word fascinating was the word that came up most of all. It's an amazing life. Somebody whose life touched so many areas of the 19th century, and a reminder to us that local history is also global history, that our local area is so connected to the rest of the world. Even in the 19th century, when we tend to think of it as being, a very small story, actually people are plugged into the rest of the world. I particularly like, Christina, your advert for Tameside Archives. I think for all local archives, Tameside and Oldham as well, great places where you can unearth these stories. I think to everyone who's listened to this, if you're inspired to visit an archive, to explore your own family history and to uncover more hidden histories like these, then I think that would be a great takeaway. I'm also with everyone else for the blue plaque as well. I have to say that feels like such an absence in a time when we're looking to make sure that the public realm has as much diversity in it as possible. So let's hope that campaign can really come off. So thank you both for that presentation. Absolutely fascinating. My final thanks to everybody who spoke at the start to launch Oldham Macfest. I hope you can interact with the other sessions that we have during the day today. And most of all, thanks to Sam Thornley, who's done so much hard work to pull it all together and to offer all the different sessions that are available. So thank you very much, everybody. And as Shamim said, go out and enjoy some sunshine between the sessions.
Sean, can you say about your background, who you're representing today?
Oh, I can. I'm sorry, Qaisra. I just popped up at the end without an introduction. Yeah, so I'm the Principal Arts and Heritage Officer at Oldham Council. I'm part of the Heritage Libraries and Arts team, responsible for the wider programme of arts and culture within Oldham. My background prior to that, I was a social history curator, and so it was with my local history hat on that I really engaged with that talk. Christina, I just mentioned again, actually, that the fairs and the pin that you have, to have some material culture, to have some little objects from a family life, those personal objects that tell so much. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sorry, Qaisra. So that was my role here in rounding things up, is that responsible for that wider arts and culture programme in Oldham.
That's fine. Thank you. Sam, back to you. If you want to remind people again.
Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Hi Sheriff, Councillor Mushtaq, Christine and Sham for the very interesting talk. I agree with everything that Sean said about that. Qaisra and the entire Macfest team for helping us arrange everything. No, if you're watching, it wouldn't be possible for us to do it without you in the audience. We'll be back here at 3 p.m. to talk to a local author, Muzeed Khan. He's on here now. It'll be the same link, so feel free to save it and click on later and join us at 3 o'clock to talk about his book, The Gift of Giving. Until then, we're all over Facebook today. We put links in the chat. Feel free to join us for some pre-recorded videos and fun. They'll be on the Oldham Libraries page as well as the Macfest UK page. Links are available. We've got some henna art, calligraphy, poetry, singing, and a lot more. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.